All right, good. Now it's afternoon, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and you are joining in the third Wednesday of the month webinar series by Forest Connect. I run the Forest Connect program, which includes this monthly webinar series. And it's always fun to bring in foresters that I meet from out and about. And I met Steve Roberge at the gathering of the Northeast Extension Foresters. I don't know if it was last year, maybe it was that pre-COVID we met,
Yeah,
Steve.
yeah, in person. Yeah,
Yeah,
2019.
yeah. So that was a longer time ago than I realized. Anyway, I was casting about, and Steve said that he had a presentation on BMPs in extreme weather, and I thought that sounded like a very good topic and one that would be popular. So Steve, thanks for joining us. I'm going to mute my microphone. You can give more of an introduction of yourself and then have at it. So thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and good afternoon. Yeah, as Peter said, I'm Steve Roberge. I'm the Extension Forester for UNH Cooperative Extension. My background comes from a county forester. Previously, I served for about 15 years as a county forester in New Hampshire, also working for Extension, but serving as one would in other states as a service forester that's out there. So really working with private landowners. So a lot of the examples that we see are BMPs or ingenuity that happens out there in the woods, the county foresters here in New Hampshire see. And we were able to put together through a grant to the Forest Service some examples of some kind of neat installations to kind of so-called weather the storm when bad things happen out there. So we'll just dive in here. So BMPs, unfortunately, it's a neat topic, but unfortunately, you need to talk more and more about extreme weather and as the climate changes and things kind of get thrown up into the air, we're not quite sure what to do, but we still need to be out there harvesting wood. There we go. So there we go. So like most states, New Hampshire has a best management practices manual for controlling erosion during timber harvest. It's really to minimize the impact of logging and to preserve water quality, preserve soil quality. I'm guessing that other states out there have similar documents as well. These are standard BMPs, as they would say, that are very effective in normal circumstances. When I say normal, I think traditional weather that we're kind of used to. And lo and behold, they work. And Extension actually did a couple of surveys over the past 15, 17 years, evaluating BMPs and looking at timber harvests that have been closed out that had stream crossings. And most of the time, the soil is stable at the stream crossings. There's little to no erosion in those installations after the job is put to bed. So we know that BMPs work, and we always recommend that loggers and foresters put them in, close them out the right way. You can walk away from that sale and be confident that you're not going to lose a slope or lose a trail or anything like that. But as we move into kind of our new future, we look at weather data from places like Hubbard Brook or other weather stations, and people studying climate out there. We're seeing, at least in New Hampshire, we're seeing less snow during the wintertime, less snowpack, less frozen ground conditions, earlier thaws, just stuff that we're kind of losing our winter. At the same time, we're probably gaining a mud season or getting more and more mud seasons. And if you look at just locally here in New Hampshire where I'm based, there's some work by Cameron Wake et al., where he puts out kind of the past, present, and future climate for New Hampshire. And it's not very encouraging. We're seeing extremes. We're seeing these open winters, less freezing, more rain, more drought, even in New Hampshire too. So we'll kind of dive into that and think about what installations we can use, what systems of best management practices we can install in a harvest, and just to ensure that we are kind of being prepared for whatever's thrown at us in terms of our changing climate. And so, in New Hampshire, at least, I know every region is going to have a different outcome in terms of climate change and our changing weather, but the increasing unpredictable severe weather is what we're seeing. So we're having more and more open winters. So less, little to no snow, less snow, and places in New England, at least, that's already happened. There's very there may be areas that don't have snowpack at all or freezing conditions. And we actually are having more than just the temporary January thaw that we have out there. We're having conditions that may be in mid-January and the ground opens up, the frost goes away, and then it freezes up for another month. So how do you plan a winter harvest when those conditions are out there? How do you stay productive during those time periods while at the same time protecting water and soil quality? In New Hampshire too, we have we're going to see more rain, more precipitation, but that's going to come in severe, heavy rain events. So a couple inches in an afternoon, 4 inches, you name it. Heavy rainstorms, big downpours, followed by periods of drought. These micro droughts, as you would say. So you'd have maybe 6 inches of rain in half a week, and then it may be 3 weeks without any precipitation at all, and it's hot and it's drying out. And so a lot of rain at once can pose a problem no matter where you are. Couple that with very dry or hydrophilic soils where that will just essentially resist any water when it comes down at a really heavy rate following a drought, and that can exacerbate this, the problems of erosion and things like that. So we here at New Hampshire Extension came up with the idea of trying to look at what installations were being used out there for BMPs in the woods. Foresters and loggers are very creative and find out ways to get the job done when they have to. And so a lot of these techniques that we've discovered were just kind of homegrown, good old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity type of thing, and just coming up with the idea of how to stay productive out there in the woods by essentially protecting soils and kind of staying out of trouble with our forest rangers as well. So retired state specialist Sarah Smith, Karen Bennett, and one of our county foresters, Jim Frenlin, were really the took the lead on this effort and created this document. You can actually go on our website, nhwoods.org. It should be nhwoods.org, not www. Sorry about that. And just look for this this document here. It's about a 20-pager, I believe. But this was an effort between UNH Extension, the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands, and the New Hampshire Timber Owners Association with a U.S. Forest Service grant to essentially highlight and show and actually continue to collect techniques to deal with these conditions. And I think these don't serve as new BMPs, but it's just a way to think out of the box, be creative, but also to share your experiences too. This is one of my pitches to you all watching. Is I'd be happy if you have some new ideas for dealing with these unpredictable conditions. Send them over. We can add them to this as well. If you want to be credited for it, that'd be great. So with that advertisement, let's move on. So just to be clear here is that the document that's new, and I actually should back up, I failed to mention, is that this came out around 2019, December 2019, the final report and this document. And we're pretty excited about it and thought we'd have a nice roadshow and all that. But then COVID hit and that kind of got buried. And we've actually just kind of taken out from the bottom of the pile and started to kind of highlight this document. So it is an older document, but it's still relevant today. But the emergency control techniques are not a replacement for best management practices, at least in New Hampshire. So just keep that in mind. It's not a new BMP manual. But when you use it together with the traditional BMPs, I think you can have really good results. And the idea of using the emergency erosion control techniques to be used for either before closeout, for a temporary closeout, and coupling those with BMPs, traditional BMPs, to really create a system that's going to really protect our soils and waters. So with any timber harvest, I'm telling you, nothing's new here, but it's all about planning, right? It's all about figuring out what you're going to do out there, what materials you have. And the idea is to actually have something in your back pocket that you can use in a rush. And so thinking about the equipment you're going to be using, if you're using a cut to length system, stockpiling brush and tops, not just in the haul roads, the forwarder roads, but just on the side throughout the forest. Allows you to get easy access when you can and actually utilize that material if needed. becoming more and more popular these days are timber mats, skidder bridge panels, things like that. You can find those used. You can, a lot of loggers will have, a collection of those, but having those on hand, not only for crossing streams, but for, just for bridging sensitive sites. We see those mats used, every day on power lines, power line easements. There's no reason why they can't be used on the landing or on sensitive sites on within the harvest, just as long as they're staying on jurisdictional wetlands and it's all up and up with either your local your state wetlands enforcement group. But other things like which I don't tend to think about is like silt fences in the truck or the utility trailer, different things to kind of catch erosion. And my favorite, and I can get into, it's a whole other kind of webinar, but it's coarse ray material, the utilization of coarse ray material for installations of kind of novel BMP practices. And we'll get a little more into that as well. The alternative to planning is lost production. It's idle time, is messing around in the mud and getting in trouble essentially. So, proper planning, proper layout, that goes without saying for any harvest, but then thinking about, what happens when this extreme weather rolls through or we lose our frost or anything like that. Having strategic, stockpiles of materials to use out there in the harvest. They may never be used, but if they are, they're going to keep you keep the production up and keep you working out there in the woods. So I usually start with some questions, and these are very basic questions. And I think with any layout that these are always asked anyway, but just think about in terms of, heavy rains, things breaking up in the winter, anything like that. So, where will the water come? Where will it go? Usually comes from the sky, but it can come from other places as well. And then once that water starts rolling, what's going to happen when bad things happen, when big storms come? A lot of our harvests happen in the winter, at least in New Hampshire. What happens when that breaks up, when that thaw goes away? It can be an unpredicted thaw, but the idea is that it's not unplanned for. So the idea is that you want to make sure that you are, again, having those materials that you can use should a thaw kind of happen. And what will happen when the skid trails and the truck roads thaw in the spring? So when you're all done with your winter harvest and you go away, you move on to a mudlot or just kind of move off site. What's going to happen to the ground that's either under the snow, under the ice, or is under the brush pile or anything like that? So just kind of thinking about all those things and kind of where the soil could go, where the water wants to go, and how to slow down that water and keep the soil in place. So with that in mind, we're going to get into some of these techniques. And again, like advances in a lot of science or silviculture, anything like that, we don't do leaps and bounds or just like these little kind of baby steps that we take. And for this case, it sounds like a new technique of extreme BMPs, but really we're just using a lot of BMPs that we know already, but just in different ways. And the same thing goes for this here is, water, that broad category of water diverters, where we're using different materials to knock water off of the skid trail, or off a haul road, or anything like that. And so when we think of the traditional use is to use water bars, right? You dig into the soil, make a mound, and that allows for water to get kicked off into the forest floor and filter down into the soil. The use of log barriers as a water diverter can be very useful, especially on frozen ground. So if you have frozen ground and then you see the forecast and there's a 4-inch rain event that's coming in, end of January, these can be installed with machinery right across the skid trails pretty easily using a piece of pulp, and then you can just leave them in place, or you can pull them out when you're back on the job if you need to shut down temporarily. I say water in so log barriers in the trails, but log barriers in the forest too. Thinking about these heavy rains, I've seen over the past few years more and more sheet flow of water just on intact canopies in the forest, just water pushing leaf litter down, scouring that site and the water came from the sky. It was at such a volume where it just, just flows and flows and flows and starts ripping out the duff layer there. The use of coarse material logs in the forest and well-placed logs in the forest can actually act as water bars and slow down, especially on those steep slopes that may be erodible to begin with. But with more and more heavy rain events, they become even more at risk. Using slash of deliberate water and using snow and ice. We'll get into all these as we move along. Log barriers, I mentioned that. There's nothing new to this. We've seen this done with Trout Unlimited, with using wood in streams to actually slow the water down, prevent it from flowing. And so here's some examples of some log barriers, but instead of being in a skid trail, they're in the stream. So it's kind of taking that idea of slowing water down, preventing leaf litter from being washed all the way down slopes, and implementing that in the forest setting. I'm a big fan of big coarse weight debris. Like I said, the bigger the better. And then if you move on to New England here, the slide that's on your left here, this is a pretty typical New England forest, hemlock forest in there. Very, very little coarse weight material that's out there. I spent my undergrad actually measuring that across New Hampshire, and there's not much big material out there that makes up our forest floor compared to the Harvard tract here in New Hampshire, which was old growth white pine that was blown over in '38. That white pine was never salvaged, so there's these massive pieces of timber or trees, massive trees are just laying on the ground. And you would expect our forest, without kind of logging going on or anything like that, may have some resemblance to that type of forest floor, where there's actually large pieces of coarse debris that's out there. You can imagine those being on steep slopes, actually acting as water diverters or just slowing down that sheet flow that we're seeing from extreme weather. So getting back to log barriers in the trail, you can see across the stream there, there's a log that's going right across, and that log was actually left behind in a winter sale on a frozen skid trail to essentially just act as a log barrier or essentially a water bar as the snow melted, and there may have been a risk of water going down that skid trail and hitting that stream there. And as you go further up that skid trail, you see more and more log barriers that are out there. You can't really see them in the photo, but trust me, they're there. Again, you can use the same example in the woods. Here's a fairly steep slope. Doesn't come out well in the photograph, but you see there's a long tree that's going essentially down slope there. You can imagine if that tree was oriented another 90 degrees, it could actually act as a barrier on that steep slope. Here's a prime example of just laying out that wood with machinery, or just felling trees to do just that. If you're doing that on site in the forest, there's the addition of coarse weight material, which is great. There's also the added bonus of protecting the leaf litter that's down from that log, and actually slowing down any sheet flow that you may see either coming off that hay field that's above it, or during a heavy rain event. This is especially important on steep slopes because they are highly erodible. Enriched sites as well. Enriched sites, they have a faster leaf turnover. So you may actually have 1 year's worth of leaves that are on there, say a really fertile sugar maple site. And so there's a small amount of leaf litter, and then you get down into that organic material. That can become erodible and wash away and actually degrade the site. Sensitive areas, if you imagine there's a wetland, and there is, downslope from here, you may want to kind of install some of these structures so that it actually slows the water, prevents any sedimentation that may get in there. And then unpredicted disturbances. I put that in there just as a reminder to talk about something, jumping worms, or the invasive jumping worms, things like that, kind of invading areas like this and just wreaking havoc with the leaf litter. And actually, eliminating it. And you can imagine with no leaf litter on a site like this, how erodible those soils would be. And having structures like, log barrier structures going across slope, that may actually help keep soil where it's supposed to be and lessen the impacts of heavy rains. So, coarse weight debris, it's definitely something to consider. I'm not advocating to go out and put logs across all slopes everywhere, but just to think about, if you're going to put a or leave, a large tree on the ground, put one on the ground. Think about the orientation of that tree and how that can help a site, especially a steep slope or a sensitive area. Getting a little less traditional here is and things that can be held in a utility trailer, in the truck, you name it, with the spill kit that loggers often are required to keep now, are things like a straw wattle as a water diverter, using a long nail to actually nail it into the ice. Again, this would be an example where you actually have a frozen haul road, but you see the weather's changing and we're going to get a rain event in the middle of winter. On the picture on the left, you can see that there is there's a public road in front of the truck there, so that's really just preventing any issues or any erosion, or any material being kind of washed out onto that road. In that example, same thing here, a compost sock, doing the same exact thing, just having kind of what I would consider non-traditional materials for timber harvest just on site, and just thinking about that. You may never use them, but if you do, you have them, and they're lightweight and easy to store, I think. Kind of going the other way, instead of building up to create a water diverter, you're actually going down. So using sand, using salt and sand to melt a water bar into your road, essentially. In some cases, I've seen folks try to melt down into it to create that gully where it acts as a water bar. In some cases, they've done both, where they pile enough salt and sand that there's a pile of salt and sand that acts as a buildup to the road, but some of it also melts down on one side as well, creating kind of a larger structure for water to hit and to be kicked off to the side. Getting pretty extreme here is using those silt fences. Usually if I see a silt fence on a logging job, there's usually something bad going on, but this is a good example of an effective use of really kind of trying to prevent any of that rain flow flowing down that packed in ice road on a logging job there. So just some different examples of non-traditional materials that one may consider. There's probably plenty of other options out there. One that we saw was rope too, just having some old rope, long lengths of it, and actually having that frozen. So that rope was thrown into a brook and then laid out, and then the idea is that would freeze in place, really just creating a jumble of rope. And when the water hits that as it flows down the road there, it actually gets slowed down and part of it gets kicked off as well. So you can be creative with those materials, but it doesn't have to be fancy. So beyond water diversion, so the idea of taking a water bar and using it in different ways, and using different materials to create that water bar is the idea of soil stabilization. Normally when we think about stabilizing soils, we're putting the job to bed, we're seeding the landing, or maybe seeding some sensitive areas that have skid trails on them, things like that. But this is the idea of what happens if we need to kind of walk away for a couple weeks here and then come back in. How do we keep that soil stable while at the same time we can't put seed down in the middle of February? So what can we do here? And in some cases using round bales to essentially going across a slope to stabilize an area. Obviously it needs a lot of equipment to do that, just to kind of spread out a big round bale like that. Using wood chips and slash to either create, again, water bars, or even just covering exposed soils with that. And then leaving woody material in place on skid trails and landings. So essentially just packing in that trail, which is pretty easy to do if you're using a cut to length system, because that's the processor can kind of make those trails and put that material in there themselves as they move along. The picture on the bottom is an old landing on top of a hill with a hay field, and kind of the brown area that you see there is wood chips that were just blown by the chipper across the landing, just to cover up the soil, just to keep it from being exposed. It was pretty high and dry, so any vegetation that would come back would take quite a while. Obviously, if you cover it with wood chips, that's also going to take a while too, but at least the ground was exposed soil at that point. This is, again, nothing new. If you imagine natural disturbances, they tend to put a lot of brush on the ground, and so the soil is protected in a number of different ways. So this is the Hurricane of 38 in Cheshire County, New Hampshire. A lot of material down. And this is really a natural condition, right? You just having that soil protected by brush. Here's an example of kind of maybe a quasi success of wood chips on a landing. This is actually my neighbor's landing, where it was a pretty sandy site. You can see some of that sand in the top of the photo on the right. But they actually covered it up with all they blew wood chips onto there. This is about seven years old now, yeah. And you can kind of see the sheet flow that's happening on that slope though, as it starts to kind of fail and some of those wood chips go away. So it's not a permanent thing. It's not a permanent installation, but I think it has served its purpose for, especially for 7 years. Maybe there needs to be some seed put down as well, or some other planting or water diversion techniques. But you can see the impacts of those heavy rains on that and causing that sheet flow and kind of rippling of the wood chips and pine needles there. Another example that we have in the technique, or in the erosion control techniques manual for extreme BMPs, is what it was called hitches and ditches, and using using small hitches to actually fill in kind of drainage ditches on roads that may be subject to sedimentation downstream. So we'll get into the case study at the end of this talk here and how to utilize that. But essentially putting temporarily that material into a ditch. In New Hampshire, that would be a non-jurisdictional wetland. So you're not filling a wetland at that point, but just a drainage ditch. So that if it did rain, or if there's large rains coming, those hitches would actually act as a filter strip, slow down the water, and prevent or allow for the sediment to essentially drop out before it hits the wetland or the stream that's down the road there. Again, nothing new here, and we're doing all the time. It's just preventing rutting and compaction with brush mats. The idea in this case is just to have that material stockpiled, or actually think about if you're on frozen ground, if you know the site, if you think about that unpredicted thaw that may happen during your winter sail, maybe you have that brush mat already installed, and that brush mat's already installed on an area that if it never thaws out, you'll never need it. But if it does thaw out, you'll have it. So that system is in place. It's insurance, so you don't end up like this John Deere operator here, making a nice mud bath there for his forwarder. So the idea again is to use the traditional use of a log, of a corduroy or a brush mat to kind of float on, but the idea is to think about pre-planning, where you're thinking, oh, if this does break up, it's going to cause a lot of headache. But if I can install this material ahead of time, and it does break up, I may be able to kind of float across and keep wood flowing, or get those last hitches out at the end of the sail there. So with that, there's corduroy. It's as I mentioned before in the previous slides, that traditional use, using it where you need it, but also laying it out where if things fall apart, then you're going to need it. So the idea is just kind of that pre-planning, asking where the water's going to go, how things are going to thaw out. And then what I've been seeing more and more in New Hampshire is that what we call big corduroy or armament, where it's essentially taking a heavy use skid trail. And this is a slope here that the trees, the oak that's in the, you can see there's a bumper log on the kind of middle left-hand side of that photo, and then there's a large oak to the left of it. That oak is probably about 24 inches in diameter. So you can see the diameter of the pulpwood that they're laying in as corduroy on this slope. And at least in New Hampshire, it's pulp and low grade is not really worth too much. So I think this is a better use of it. It's actually just essentially arming that road so that you can actually put your machines on it and you're not messing around with mud at all. And it's just a real, we call it big corduroy, or just armament, sorry, of that slope. You can see some other examples there too, just large corduroy moving on the sensitive sites. And then the pine site that's in the snow is a pretty soft site. And so a good portion of that sail was put on that big corduroy with low grade material. In some cases, the logger went back and pulled that material and actually put it on a truck and sent it off. In some cases, it's left on site. I mentioned timber mats earlier, and using those as decking or as a stable footing for your machinery. Here's an example of a log landing. You can see where the forwarder is coming in on the upper right there. It's pretty soft soft ground coming in, but and if you imagine trying to back up a log truck into there, either you're constantly pulling that truck in with a forwarder or skidder, or the truck just can't get in just because it's so greasy with mud. By installing those timber mats, you actually create a deck for them to work and operate on. That unties your forwarder from actually having to pull log trucks into the landing, and allows them to essentially pull wood to the landing. And it really helps out with kind of the efficiency of the landing itself. The other benefit of using something like this too is that if you had that log truck in that mud, you have all that mud tracking out onto the public road. Nothing gets the Conservation Commission and the towns a little angry than using or putting a lot of mud on the road on sales like this. So timber mats, pretty valuable there. The concept that I recently came across, and thanks to Keith Canody up at UMaine, is the concept of safe wood and not so safe wood, or unsafe wood. And when I say safe wood, I'm not talking about trees that are stable and not safe wood being snags or widowmakers. I'm talking about wood that's safe to harvest anytime during the year, or it's on good dry ground, good well-drained wood here. And here's the example of a kind of a sale area here in New Hampshire. The kind of two polygons there, but in the middle there's a stream with some hydric soils and a stream crossing. And you can see the landing is actually tied to what we call the safe wood. So that wood's safe to harvest any time. It can be very productive in there, but the conditions need to be right for you to get into that not safe wood, not so safe wood, as I call it. And so you can be stranded. You can kind of lose the production on the not so safe side of that harvest because your stream crossing is falling apart, or that those hydric soils are becoming tough to cross. And the idea is to focus your time and your energy when the conditions are good, when the ground's frozen or things are right for that crossing. You're being as productive as you can to get all the wood out of that not so safe zone to the landing, and then using the safe wood area for times of thaws or breakups, or when it's not going to be good to be on the other side of that stream. So you're essentially keeping that area, although closer, although maybe better wood, it's also better ground that allows you to operate and keep moving when conditions kind of fall apart, and that not so safe side is not an option for you. So just kind of thinking about that planning, and that may mean bouncing around a couple times. So that may cut down on production a little bit, but it's better than cutting all the safe wood and then having that not so safe wood stranded out there for a year or two before you can get to it. So getting into some case studies here before we wrap up is a site in Dorchester. Let me pull my notes up here. There we go. There's a 80-acre site. 50 acres was first harvested during the first winter, and the remainder of the sale would be cut the following winter. The harvest contained one large brook, which you can kind of see a little bit. It's kind of on the just south of the landing, and essentially west to the landing as well, and many small streams that they had to cross. So you had those stream crossings, and just a braiding of streams you had to deal with. So that type of site made it really good for winter ground conditions, and that's what they were looking for. And then BMPs used the two bridge panels for the forwarder. They used and harvester, and then they used logs and small poles for pull forwards in those small streams. And so it's essentially just kind of installing those traditional BMPs just to get across and do the work. The less obvious BMPs that were used, and maybe you can consider them innovative or not, or just even traditional, but just thought of in a different light, was choosing not to use some old skid trails that were too wet or too rutted. So just avoiding that area, and then and not using an old stream crossing that had a pretty deflated approach, essentially. So there's a really flattened out approach to that old stream crossing, probably because it was used extensively in the past, and actually choosing a new stream crossing there. this was breaking up in the mid-February thaw, and so a lot of the wood was actually forwarded at night when the ground was frozen, or during early mornings during those frozen conditions. So thinking about timing with that too. So that's what the crew chose to do on this site here. And so here's the machinery is used, as I mentioned, harvester and a forwarder, and then using this was 2 panels using large logs as abutments for those bridges. And then you can see here is they had to shut down on one of those days due to rain. They actually installed, you can see in the red circle, the red oval, a log diverter there, essentially building up that brush and logs to actually act as a water bar, so the water doesn't flow down the skid trail into the water. And then thinking ahead, they did have pull forwards that were necessary. But this was a site, and they had several sites like that, where if the ground did go or the conditions started to thaw, that would become a problem. It probably didn't need to have a pull forward or brush mat installed on this site when the ground was frozen, but they knew that when and if the ground did thaw, it would become a problem. So just planning ahead, installing those structures so you don't have to do it or get stranded out there when you're operating in thawing conditions. Same idea here, just those pull forwards, those brush mats on those softer sites. And again, those softer sites are normally frozen, but if they thaw out, then they become a problem. Here's that wetland or the stream crossing that they avoided. You can see you can see the kind of where the old road went, and the stream kind of creeps up the road there. It's what I call deflated, just not a good approach. It makes it much longer crossing. And you probably would have to fill that in with a lot of material, and who knows where the bottom is, something like that. So they did choose to a better stream crossing location, good strong approaches, so you can span those with your skidder bridge panels or your panels. And in this case too, they actually pulled those panels because they knew there was a heavy rain coming. They weren't quite sure what the stream would do and how flashy it would be. The same thing goes with their pull forwards too. They actually pulled poles out to allow for better water flow. And then once that storm passed and the watershed drained out, they popped them back in and started operations once the conditions were right. So moving on, that second case study in Errol, New Hampshire, that's up in the North Country. Let me scroll to my notes here. This was a much larger sale. The first entry was summer, kind of dry spell, where they entered that in. About 90 acres was harvested, leaving the remainder. In the second year, the second entry to harvest in the wintertime, about 200 acres. They had a very large stream crossing they had to deal with, and because of that, they brought in a 30-foot steel portable bridge to act as a skidder bridge. And the unique thing that they use here, you can see that this is an old logging road that they had there that was in pretty stable shape, and they actually skidded down that road, and that's that ditch I was talking about. So that's not a jurisdictional stream. You can see there's water running in it now in that picture, but that really wasn't considered a wetland, but was indeed leading to a wetland, and they found that it was pretty prone to picking up sediment and bringing it down. So they had to do something about that. You can see the equipment they're using: traditional cut length, larger landing, grapple with the shear there, and I mentioned that large stream crossing, pretty big on that site. And so, going to the old logging road that they used there, they decided to install these ditches these hitches in the ditch, as they call it, hitches and ditches. And they treated it almost like water bars. So they actually had a hitch, every so feet, and the idea was to slow down any of that water, and not to create just one big log jam in the middle, of the slope there, but they have a number of small, tiny kind of filters or log jams that the water would never be able to gain speed and essentially wash out the road that's next to it. These were temporary, and when they were done, they were pulled out and with little impact to the wetland down the ditch there. Here's the example of that crossing, kind of plowing it out and installing it, laying down some larger logs to act as abutments, there. Installation of that steel panel. Nothing, you know, if you've done this before, is nothing exciting, but that downstream approach that you have there, or that look that you see there. So, well, you know, out of the water, but actually spans quite a distance. It allows them to be pretty productive. And again, this is a kind of the same the same idea as using big corduroy, right? Is that it may spend a little more time to pack that corduroy in that slope, and maybe a little money too with lost volume. But the idea is that slope is now your main highway, and it's a very productive approach in and out of the timber sale. The same thing with this bridge too. There may have been other options to deal with, but this bridge allowed for good infrastructure, temporary infrastructure, and fairly a cost-effective way of putting it in. And so once that was established, they were able to use that bridge as essentially the main highway and just get wood in and out, or wood out of the harvest area onto the landing. Example of looking at the approach, and essentially building up the approach with brush and logs, so that you do with any normal skidder bridge. And then the closeout conditions here too. I think it's, you know, it goes without saying that goes back to what I talked about when we did our studies or reviews of past timber harvest. We quite often found them like this. Put to bed, looking very stable, with no signs of erosion or impacts to the wetland, or in this case, the stream here. And so you can see that across slope again, across the stream, you actually have a log barrier that's installed there. There's a couple more that are upslope as well on the approach that's on our side here, seeded in, very stable soil. No signs of rutting or anything like that. So pretty good result considering the size of the installation I was put in there, and the conditions as well. So so I'll leave it with that, and just come back to that manual, or the document that we have here. If you go to our website, I will remind you, it's just nhwoods.org, not the www. That won't get you anywhere, but nhwoods.org, and search for the title. You can download a copy yourself, take a look at it, and feel free to send me an email or any thoughts you may have about some of the stuff that you're doing out there in the woods. So good. So with that, Peter, I'm happy to go through. I see there's some chats and some folks talking about it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And
yeah.
Steve, that was great. I enjoyed that very much. I appreciate you sharing all of that. Let me, I'm just going to slide the chat window over here.
Yeah.
So, wow, all right, lots going on. So one question that came up from a couple people was the potential for problems from the salt. You'd showed a picture of putting down salt and sand to kind of thaw out a trench. Where did the salt go, and were there complications with that and impacts to the plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that would be, you know, I can't speak exactly to, you know, what the impacts would be. I imagine this was used as an example on a heavier road that was used, a main haul road that would go out to a public road with that. But yeah, certainly salt does have impacts, and I wouldn't be broadcasting salt all over the sale area like that, especially in the woods either. But this was a site that was closer to a main road, you know, main kind of public road that would normally be exposed to salt. But of course, if you're working in areas that are in, you know, watershed areas, things like that, that may not be an option for you, right? Because you want to protect the groundwater that's out there. But I think for the volume that's being used, it's probably pretty minimum, but definitely salt can have impacts on the site there. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, and then question from Minnesota, where they're prior to harvesting, they do a lot of control of woody invasive, and they're wondering if maybe seems like using some of that, it's the woody invasive shrubs as mats. And the question is there a size that's too small to be functional? I mean, most of the picture you have up now, that's some pretty decent sized materials. Would woody shrubs be of benefit, or maybe if there was enough? I mean, some of those areas can have lots of acres of multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle and buckthorn. So it kind of sizing of the brush and the trails.
Yeah, I think that's probably a little, glossy buckthorn comes to mind. You said, Peter, it's just like you can have a whole understory filled with glossy buckthorn. There's a couple of risks to that too. Chances are if you're treating that site for invasives already, there's probably already a seed bank that exists there. But if you're running your equipment over that brush mat of invasive plants that may have seeds still stuck to it, or may be able to essentially germinate vegetatively, your equipment may be spreading it further, across uninfested areas. If it's a larger sale, or if folks aren't used to washing their equipment after sales, they may be actually moving that material. So that's one kind of problem I can think of by doing that. The other thing is typically that material, multiflora rose, bush honeysuckle, glossy buckthorn, things like that, tends to be pretty small. And I suspect you'd need a lot of it to make an impact on this type of machinery. You're right. The material we're talking about here is probably, it's pole sized and up. So 4 inches, 6 inches. If we're using that big corduroy, it may even be 14, 18 inches in diameter. So pretty big stuff that we're using here, just to keep the machinery kind of up off the mud, off that soft soils. But that's an innovative approach and something to think about more. And it just comes back to planning and thinking about the material that you have on site. So that's definitely an option too. Yeah. But yeah. And I can think of our friend American Beach, that you could probably be used for that same use.
Sure. Okay, Ryan was interested in how you measured. So you talked about the effectiveness of emergency water diversions and how you measured or assessed or compared those with more traditional techniques.
Yeah, so this work wasn't really a comparative study of those, but it was really looking at some kind of innovative techniques that folks were doing out there in the woods. So, and just kind of consolidating their thought process and their planning process into a document that could be kind of shared with other folks, and also kind of maybe create some other conversations about other effective techniques. And so, so what I'm getting at is that, not a scientific comparison, of anything out here. The field studies or the field analysis that we did of BMPs, of traditional BMPs in the 2000s, that was a process that we actually had. We're doing a bunch of measurements and collecting data on that. But this effort here was more of a kind of essentially telling the story about these practices that are used. In some cases are used all the time, but just not shared with others. They're kind of hidden out there in the woods.
So when the loggers do that, they must. So it's not an obligation. They've decided that there's a benefit to them, and either because of perception or because they have better and longer operability in season. I mean, so it's interesting that that's kind of a initiated from the logger rather than a top-down approach.
Yeah, absolutely. In New Hampshire, a lot of these practices are voluntary, so they're not regulatory. So now you don't have to go out and put in water bars after a timber sale. If something bad happens, then you're going to get fined and all that. But if nothing bad happens and there's no water bars, then that just kind of does its thing. And and so the example of kind of the big corduroy, that slope that was packed in with those pulp logs, that was done out of necessity. They needed that slope to hold up, and they knew it was a pretty wet slope. It wasn't a wetland, it wasn't a fill or anything like that, but they knew it was a soft site, and if the ground broke up, they would essentially lose any production that they had on that spot. And so they made sure that site was operable regardless of the conditions.
Neat. Scott wants to know if permits are required to place material in streams or in wetlands.
In New Hampshire, yes. I can't speak to other states, but in New Hampshire, we have a notification. It's a forestry notification with the Department of Environmental Services, and that notification does a couple things. One, it triggers our Natural Heritage Bureau to do a review of rare, threatened, and endangered species on the site in which you're installing that water crossing or wetland crossing. And then it also has the forester or logger essentially say what type of installation you'll be putting in. And each installation is temporary, up to 2 years. And it has to be removed after 2 years. And also has to be an approved, essentially, crossing of some sort. So pole forward or skidder bridge in some cases, things like that. But yep. And so every state is different. I have a hard enough time keeping up with New Hampshire's.
Sure.
So I'm not sure about New York or Vermont.
Yeah. No, right. And I assume the question was specific to New Hampshire. So,
yep.
but people need to be aware of the variation from state to state.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a good point, Peter, is that, what is done in here is New Hampshire specific. So that's why I say, use this in concert with your BMP manual. Also use it in concert with your state laws, your environmental rules that are there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Should be a disclaimer.
Okay. Yeah. So Rick wants to know, let's ask about the hitches and ditches. Yeah. And wondering about the risk of slowing the drainage to the point that it might flood the road, and how is it, what's the kind of the art of getting enough to be effective, but not too much that you create other problems.
Yeah, right. It's like plugging out the culvert, right? That was a conversation that we had with this. It's like, well, what's the risk? This seems a little risky because we don't, because exactly that would happen, right? So the thought was, and that it goes back to looking at traditional BMPs and the spacing of water bars. So water bars are spaced based on slope, and so for wherever the slope is, it will dictate the spacing in between each water bar. And that's kind of how they approached it, is that they went early and often with these hitches. So the idea is that the water never had a chance to gain momentum, and so it would just be a slow trickle through all these things. And it worked out for them, but it doesn't mean that couldn't happen in the future. So that was one that was always like, this could go bad one way or the other. But the same thing could go bad with a misplaced water bar, or water bar spacing that is too far apart. Is that, I have water bars, but the water is allowed to gain momentum and really either jump that water bar or actually just wash out parts of the road.
Okay. And I'm jumping around a little bit. Are there pictures of so you showed the ditch in the road, but you didn't have pictures of hitches and ditches. Are there pictures in the manual? Are there pictures or?
And embarrassingly enough, that nice drawing, I'm not sure who drew that on staff, or who drew that on staff, but that's all we got. We never had a chance to get on site to.
Okay.
So it's actually a really pathetic diagram, right?
So no, but it's good. I like it. It gets the point across. So I guess that's a challenge to the audience, that somebody needs to come up with a picture of hitches and ditches and share it with you, and we'll make it go viral on the internet.
Yeah, we'll credit you in the photo there. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So David is asking about when placing bridges or presumably other structures, do you take into account the volume and velocity, potential volume and potential velocity of water at that point, so that you can, sizing, how do you figure out the sizing?
Watershed is a big one, right? So what's the watershed acreage that's behind that culvert that you're putting in there? And most of those culvert calculations are actually, they're pretty dated. Those are under the quote unquote noted traditional kind of weather that we would see. And so especially with culverts, if you're sizing a culvert, it's what the manuals say. You need a 12-inch culvert, but you probably need a 18 or something a little bigger. So that's something to consider with that. With bridges in New Hampshire, at least, if you bridge from shoreline to shoreline or stream bank to stream bank, you don't need a permit at all, actually, because you're not impacting a jurisdictional wetland. And so that's usually the goal when we're talking about skidder bridge panels, that large 35-foot steel bridge type of thing. If you can keep the material and the bridge and the abutments out of the wetland itself, that's even better because you're not impacting anything at that point. But yeah, culverts, definitely there is calculations usually based on the size of the water body itself, the stream, and also the land, I'm sorry, the watershed acreage that's behind that. So yeah. And then I'll just point out too, mentioning kind of just BMPs in general, what I'm laying out, when I've laid out bridges in the past, or stream crossings in the past, I am kind of looking for maybe not a pinch point in that stream, but you're looking for an area that has well-defined stream banks. And so the idea of avoiding those deflated approaches, those really kind of soft areas that lead up to a stream, even if it's not an old skid trail. It may be frozen in January, but in February that may thaw out and create a whole mess of problems for you. And it actually may be a wetland in itself that's next to a stream. So avoiding those areas is good. But just keep in mind kind of the lay of the land there.
Okay. And I'll just call everybody's attention. There's a couple of good examples of things that were shared by Tim and James.
Yeah, thanks.
Let's see. So Raymond offered a description. Raymond, I'm going to mispronounce his name. Berthamy. I apologize. So Raymond, timestamp 1249, typed in the description of putting hitches in ditches.
Yeah, that was actually Ray's job up there. So
all right,
for tagging
cool.
On. Yeah, good demonstration there.
Yeah.
Hopefully I got it all right, Ray.
Gareth wants to know how much does the brush matter slashed as an erosion control measure affect regeneration and shelter wood or patch cuts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like I said, I like coarse weight material. I don't like deer. And we've actually done some experimentation with leaving tree tops behind as a deterrence for deer. Of course, these are larger, higher tree tops that aren't being smashed or run over by equipment. So those are two different things. I think when we think about a cut the length system, sometimes those brush mats can be pretty thick, not in terms of height, but also just kind of packed with material. And that can be, I think, a hindrance to regeneration, in the short term. But there's obviously a lot of benefits to that in terms of protecting the soil and keeping things in place. So I think the tighter packed that material is, on a skid trail, the better it's going to be at slowing water down and may prevent, say, an acorn from kind of getting in there. But if that acorn falls down in between a couple of logs, that's in that skid trail, chances are it's going to be pretty well protected in the short term. But it's tough to tell. I think a good scattering of tops across the site is probably beneficial to regeneration, just because it makes it just a little more harder for especially deer to get and nibble at tops of those. Of course, rodents would love it because it's great cover for them too. So there's a trade-off there. But that slash mat I think is pretty thick, but it does a great job at preventing erosion.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, those are great questions and some really good additional advice and input from the audience. So I appreciate people, sharing what they know and what they've experienced. So yeah. Steve, that's all the questions that I see. I want to thank you very much for this presentation. This was super interesting. And for those of you that are interested, you've already done all you need to do for your continuing ed credits. I'll be sending those out. And this webinar will be, this one in this evening's will be archived. One of them will be posted to my YouTube channel. So the youtube.com/forestconnect. And I'm gonna, there's some good enough, they're very good comments. And so I've saved the chat and I'll annotate that and post that online as well, connecting it to the YouTube channel. So Steve, thank you. We'll
Yeah.
see Steve back here at 7 o'clock tonight, and any of you that want to see the presentation again can also come back at 7. So
Yeah, great.
take care, everyone. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Take care, everyone.